For rate-based regulation, you're essentially talking about an equation. It is pounds of carbon dioxide over megawatt hours generated. And then if you go to page 1489 of the 1560 in the preamble, you will see that the rest of that equation is at the under the bottom line is plus megawatt replacement generation. Now, I want to underscore that because one of the fundamental concepts that has changed since Trevor Hauser and I were here last year. You remember Trevor said, geez, you guys got enough wind, put that in the bottom of the equation, you're all set, no problem. So we've been talking for some time about who controls the credits that come off the wind. That's not the way they're thinking about it now. The way they're thinking about it now is at an electric generating unit level. And they're essentially expecting that generating units that participate in a mass-based program will be essentially fulfilling that equation. All right? So if you are under a rate-based arrangement, and if you are an electric generating unit, whether you're lumped in with your sister units at Jim Bridger, for example, or standing on your own, the idea is essentially you got to go procure megawatt hours to stick into the bottom of your equation. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, there are some consequences of this that are not immediately obvious. And I'm going to first tell you about mass, and I come back to what the consequences are. Mass-based regulation only pays attention to how much CO2 is coming out the stack. That's it. They establish a limit on that number, and then that limit slowly goes downward. All right. There are two different ways that you acquire the right to continue operating under a rate-based situation or the mass-based situation. I told you in the rate-based situation, you got to add replacement generation to the number of megawatt hours if you're going to stay in business. In the mass-based arrangement, the state, or if the state's absent, the federal government dictates and hands out the allowances. Now, why is that different? Well, if you go look at the federal program, you'll realize that when they set an overall target for allowances, they hand out some to the utilities, and then they hold back some in reserve. In the federal program that is proposed right now, there are 3 pots of allowances held out. One to create incentives to move forward with renewables, one to support renewables directly, and there's one other to address something called leakage. The important thing is to understand that you're essentially creating money when you do that. So if I hand out 90% of my allowances, hold back 10% in reserve, the EPA will tell you, I haven't made that more stringent. All the utilities got to go do is buy up those allowances if they want to emit to the max that's available. You with me so far? Now, it gets to be a big number. In California, where they have a cap and trade program in place already, I was talking to somebody at one of our conferences about a month ago now, the number that's in the pot that's been generated by the state-held allowances, state-retained allowances, is now $400 million. This is enough to get a lot of people's attention. So the disposition of the allowances is directly controlled by the state. The way you get emission rate credits, that is the megawatt hours below the line in a rate-based system, is the state puts into place a system of tracking megawatt hours generated in a way that can be used in that equation, and then following them around until they're retired. But it's essentially more of a private sector solution, okay? With the allowances, there's much more government involvement. So, for example, when we sat down in front of one of the legislative committees last week, we said, you know, one of the things that you may want to do in the category of please don't act yet, if somebody makes a decision to have a mass-based program, that kind of decision really ought to be made by the legislature with a lot of input from a lot of people rather than by Todd and me over a cup of coffee, which is a perfectly interesting alternative, but probably not going to be one that's going to make people happy. So, and frankly, anytime you're generating money, it's a good time for the legislature to be involved because it's a public policy decision. But you have two sharply different arrangements. Now, unanticipated consequences. About a week ago, I got a call from one of my fellow commissioners in the state of Washington saying, now that this thing's come out, he said, we have some people that would really like, I'll translate it in a slightly snarky way, but really would like to sell you some energy efficiency because we know you have problems in Wyoming with all your coal generation. And I said, Phil, the only problem with that is, unless we know whether on a mass basis or a rate basis, we really don't know whether there's anything to talk about. Because if you're on a rate basis, nobody cares about your energy efficiency. And it's nice you got it. But in terms of adding that to anybody's bottom line so they can make a rate-based decision, if you're under a mass-based arrangement, who cares? Now, why are we suggesting that the mass-based has implicitly been preferable? First of all, it has a history stretching back to the acid rain days of the EPA having systems for accounting for allowances. So they got one of those already, right? It's not geared up to do this yet, this scale, but they've already been down this road before. An ERC is not the same as a REC. So you've heard of renewable energy credits before. The difference between the two, so now we've got an idea where the allowances go. Right now, there's nothing in place to similarly trade rate-based credits. Okay, now we're going to back up and start again from the perspective of the whole thing that EPA is doing. In the proposed rule, as Todd was explaining, what the EPA did was tell the states, we're going to have a method that suggests to you how much the state is going to have to figure out with its utilities, how much carbon dioxide is going to have to reduce. So they had this method that was really applied on a state-by-state basis. Now what they've done, see that big country there? They're calling it 3 regions, but basically everything in every one of those regions has been lumped together. So if you look at our region, for example, I can tell you that the heaviest sub-region for coal use is us in Colorado. Nearly as heavy is Utah, northern Nevada, and parts of New Mexico and Arizona. And then the third heaviest is down south. If you look at Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, they have hardly any coal. It's very heavy in hydro, and California is very heavy in natural gas. So the reason I raise that is because EPA blithely dismisses the thought that they have to do anything more than account for all the plants in these regions. Why? Because they want to get to a single national number and then create a national market or markets in tradable allowances and tradable RECs. Now, I submit to you, without yet being able to prove it, but watching what's happened in places where there is a regional transmission organization, what we're essentially looking at is an arrangement that will eventually lead to what's effectively a single price or a very narrowly banded price for electricity nationwide. If you're in a place like Wyoming, which has historically been low and will begin to have to buy allowances and or ERCs in order to continue to provide electricity, our prices are going to go up. If you're in California, happy days are here again, because you're going to be selling whatever you got to sell to somebody else. And particularly if you're in Washington or Oregon, if you have renewables and hydro, some way it's supposed to work out, so we're all going to be in the position of having traded things. But the basic idea is the price is going to tend to a national level. That's not good for us, and I'm not sure that it's a policy that anybody intended when they put together the Clean Air Act and then decided to regulate carbon. And this is a radical shift in the economic base of the United States. Okay. Now, from looking at everybody, does anybody have any questions about this particular piece? Because I'm going to move on to something else in a second. Maybe this would be a good time to, if you have a question about, particularly about mass-based and rate-based, why we need to care. Okay. But obviously, that's the thing we have to start talking about. And you notice that we don't have to make a decision about this until 2017. Why? Because the federal government itself has this rule that is not yet in place, where they haven't yet chosen whether they're going to do mass-based or rate-based. Now, what are the consequences of their choice? If they decide to do mass everywhere, then there ain't going to be much of a market for ERCs. If they decide to do rate everywhere, that's going to affect the market for allowances, which we already know exist in the New England RGGI states and in California. If they do a mix, how's anybody going to plan anything? We have created, they are in the process of creating a system where being a utility executive, God bless you, Mark, is a very difficult business. Because how are you going to think reasonably going forward? The people that I regulate are long-term thinkers. They have made big investments. They're supposed to last a long time. And now we're in a situation where they're being fundamentally told the country's taken a sharp turn and you got to think a different way about that. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is how they calculated that number. Todd mentioned to you that the Western interconnection number was dramatically lower than the Eastern interconnection number. How did they get there? Well, they did it this way. There are really only three components in every one of the compliance years, starting in 2022 through 2030, has a calculation for each of the three interconnections. So 30 calculations. And if you were to open up your notebooks right now and you were to go to EPA Clean Power Plan and look for technical support documents, and then go to Appendix 4 of the support document for the calculation of emissions guidelines, you can see what I'm showing. I didn't try to put that on because it's a wide spreadsheet, but it's not as complicated as you might think. They basically add up all the natural gas and all the coal, which they refer to as fossil steam. So all the coal-fired generation and all the natural gas generation in each of the interconnections is added up, put into a pot. They make some adjustments to it, but they're not significant for our purposes. Then the next thing they do is, for each interconnection, they make the adjustment for what they now agree is the possible heat rate improvement. So 2.1% is really kind of trivial the way this works. Then the next thing they do is, you would think if they were talking about building blocks like they did last time, if you talked about building block 1, 2, 3, and 4, there was an adjustment you made at each stage which got you to a final place. That's not the way they're doing it this time. The next adjustment they make is for renewable energy. Okay? The way they've made this adjustment largely rests on onshore wind. Why is that? Because they have assumed that, particularly once we get into the compliance period, that we will be able to build onshore wind at the rate that was built in 2012, with a capacity factor of 41.8%. Now, that doesn't mean anything to you, so I need to provide you some context. The number in 2012 was more than twice as much as any other amount of installed wind. It dropped to basically less than a 13th in the following year of what 2012 was because the production tax credit expired and everybody was rushing to put wind into place. The number they used in 2012 is more than twice of any other year for wind. The idea that you can grow it that fast, to those of us that are kind of in or on the periphery of the business, particularly in areas of environmental constraint, seems crazy, but that's the number they use. And then with the 41.8% capacity, what they're essentially doing is assuming that if they generate with sun or wind, something at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that's as good as baseload generation that's available 24 hours a day. It's a wrong number. But it makes for a large portfolio of renewables, large and optimistic portfolio of renewables. They also decide, parenthetically, that in the course of considering transmission, their essential argument is, we're going to be building a lot of transmission going forward anyway. This won't be that much different, so we don't have to worry about that. If you're all aware of what's going on with the sage-grouse, you realize that transmission that chops up their little sage-grouse habitat is like a slice and dice machine. It's something it's a real constraint in the West for the addition of further transmission. But EPA also further says, since we've got a national market, if you're a coal plant in Wyoming and you got somebody in another state that can put in a renewable asset of some sort and funnel into the grid, we'll give you credit for that in Wyoming. So that means you don't really have any problem in Wyoming with the sage-grouse because fundamentally we're going to create a national market and you can go make your investment somewhere else. Think about this for a minute. I also have to say that I think that's a little crazy in practicality. At some point, actually, I'll save that point for a second. So, all right, so what were they doing? So they start off, what they do is then take all this renewable energy and then assume it's all going to be in place. They assume that that energy will be in place and take it out of their projected fossil fuel generation and natural gas generation. They do a little percentage calculation of how much in the Western interconnection, for example, is gas and how much is coal. Then they allocate all that to the existing generation and assume that all that generation is going to be gone as a result. Then, if this doesn't strike you as being something that I'm in the business of doing hearings where people have to come to me and explain to me why something's reasonable and why I should fine for them. And I can't imagine ever fining for somebody that came and proposed that to me. It's just bizarre. 15 years out, you're going to know what's going to happen. That's going to be a maximum development of renewables without any concern for transmission. Strikes me as a little crazy, but that's fine. That may misspeak because I'm from Wyoming. The third block is to redirect natural gas to eliminate or reduce fossil steam. Now, the way they do this is also a little interesting. For those of you that have been involved with renewables, you would know that typically what happens is you put in a renewable asset, particularly if it's large, and there generally has to be some coal or some natural gas backup. Okay? You don't, it's like, I don't know, sending archers out without knights. They always get slaughtered, in the movies. You really have to have some natural gas backup because otherwise it's really not a useful asset. One of the things that they did then, though, nonetheless, was they started out with the existing set of natural gas plants and said, with the existing set of natural gas plants, we are going to assume we can operate them all at 75%, and then that will be a cap, ultimately, on how much more gas we say will be developed. So if you look at the numbers for Wyoming, there's a subroutine, it's like called BB5, and it basically, they do a 22% increase between 2012 and 2022, and their rationale for that is this the highest growth year for natural gas development, for natural gas combined cycle installations. So they take that number from historical and they increase it by 5% a year until they reach their cap. Now, as Todd said, they use the Eastern Interconnection, and to me, I think it's important with the best systems for emission reduction to stop and ask yourself, wait a second, before you put in a fudge factor, before you decide that you don't have to worry about the results, you need to consider what the results are. The results are not just to eliminate coal-fired generation in Wyoming. They are to eliminate coal-fired generation in the entire West by 2027. All that orange, no more coal-fired power plants. And they, frankly, they sharply reduce gas usage too. One of the things that they do is they have a target for reducing gas usage, natural gas usage, as well as coal usage, but not as much. Their target's not as impossible as the coal target. And there's even a subroutine where you might be able to buy ERCs based on a gas plant, which has more than met its target, which seems to me inconceivable knowing where the numbers are for the gas plants. So what their mathematics say is that by 2027, there are going to be no coal-fired power plants in the West. You're going to be relying only on the gas plants you got, so no new gas plants. You're going to add a whole bunch of renewables, and it's all going to work. Now, in my line of work, what that means is, you look at that and you think, well, you know, as I was saying last night, if you were to tell the President of the United States that all the coal-fired generation in the West were to be gone by 2027, they'd be thinking nuclear attack. I mean, it's just bizarre to even think that. It seems to me that when you get a bizarre result like that, the answer is you go back and think about whether you've characterized the problem and the possibilities in the right way. You don't just say, here's what they do. Here's what they do. They take a part of the country that has plants of completely different vintage and largely different capacity usage, and pick that number and say, this is going to provide the basis for the whole country. And the reason that's going to be okay is because it's going to provide what they refer to as headroom. So if you would go into the 1,400 or the 1,500 page document and punch in find for headroom, you'll see it popping up, and it's you know, at first you really don't understand what they're trying to tell you, but the answer is they've applied a fudge factor. And they're essentially saying, in our beneficence, we're going to make it really easy for everybody by using the number that was generated for the Eastern Interconnection. I mean, it does a few incidental things. Since they're using the Eastern Interconnection, they have a 4.3% number up front for what they're supposed to be improving their heat rates for. We get 2.1, so we get gypped out of the 2.1%. We get nickel and dime coming and going in this arrangement. Okay, so I think as a result of all this that the best systems for emission reduction needs to be challenged, because I don't think it makes sense to run a country by starting out with a method that gives you really absurd results in two large parts of the country, and probably gives you absurd results in large portions of the Eastern Interconnection as well. Now, could you find for me the list of power plants? Yeah, the one that has, there's one other thing I wanted to talk to you about. So how expensive is this going to be for us? Well, I've got a back-of-the-envelope way to think about this that I'll share with you in just a second, where you got all 10 of them lined up. Go back one more. Or have you passed it already?
You want the one with the long list?
The long list of all, yeah, there you go, there, okay. All right. The first thing I think about how you try to figure out how expensive this is going to be is you can't. How are you going to figure out in the Western Interconnection on any rational basis what this is going to cost you when you're not starting out with a reasonable basis to start out with? That's not a rational basis. You have no way to do a calculation. So what did we do in my office? We did sort of the next best thing. We did a back-of-the-envelope calculation. And what you do is you can see that there's a rate of emission associated with these various plants, okay? We did the following calculation. We figured if we get the entire coal plant to 1305, which is the 2030 number, how many ERCs are we going to have to do that? So it's actually not that complicated. All you got to do is take the same formula I told you before. You got your carbon on top, your megawatt hours down below. You know what rate you now want, 1305. And for each one of the plants, you can add ERCs until you get there. And interestingly enough, it does work out mathematically as long as you assume that the carbon dioxide emissions are constant. It turns out to be the same number of replacement. So you're actually replacing X number of megawatt hours. It turns out mathematically that you could characterize those as replacement generation. The result is 18,805,487 megawatt hours in 2030. Okay, remember, this has to repeat itself each year. Then you can do the following. So the question is, how much is it going to cost you? Well, we can ignore for the second, for the time being. We're going to take EPA, its word on a few things. We're going to say, we're going to ignore Todd's observation. You can't do that in Wyoming. And we're going to say, somewhere, somehow, we're going to say these plants can invest in some, we'll say, wind. Back of the envelope calculation, I'll keep it simple. Then you divide that by 8,760 hours because you're trying to create a quantity, right? Megawatt hours into a rate, which is megawatts. And then we'll even use their absurd capacity factor of 41.8%. And the result of that is you need a wind farm with a nameplate capacity of 5,136 megawatts. So that's bigger than Chokecherry and what's one? Yeah, combined. Bigger than anything that's on the books, but nonetheless, theoretically possible. Then, all we did was take the 5,136, multiply it by 1,000 to get to megawatts, or kilowatt hours rather. And then I took from Pacific Corp's Integrated Resources Plan their current number. Now the EPA says that the value, that the amount capital you have to invest for wind and solar is going to drop over time. I wonder whether that's not industry propaganda, so I kind of ignored that argument, and I'm just using the number that was in Pacific Corp's IRP, which I think is pretty reliable because we test that stuff, we poke that stuff a lot. The number you wind up with is, for our units in Wyoming to stay in business on this model, you need $11.1 billion worth of capital investment in wind. Now, think about this for a minute. You're now on a utility in a climate where the EPA has just, particularly for Wyoming, done you serious damage in terms of your prospects and the sense of your business entirely. They're expecting you to come up with $11.1 billion to provide wind farms somewhere. Now, if it's not wind farms, it's solar, but nonetheless, you're going to wind up with something, I think, on that order of magnitude. And that's just the capital you have to put in. This is capital, kind of, you could do it over a period of years running up to 2030, but that's where you got to wind up. Pacific Corp also has numbers for operations and maintenance and so on and so forth. If you do depreciation, operations and maintenance, and the like, you wind up with annual operating costs of on the order of $558 million for the suite of units. I don't know if you have any sense of scale of what utilities charge their customers in Wyoming, but that gets to be a big number. Since we export 60% of our electricity, that's not a number that we would assume all by ourselves. But I can tell you 11.1 billion is more than all we've got, all the book value we've got available in Wyoming as you sit here today. It's a really big number. And this is, and I've used this part because one of the problems I've got is I don't know how you come up with, without knowing that the market even exists for ERCs, I don't know how you come up with that. So their answer is, well, you can always invest in a facility. So invest in a facility, you wind up with a big number. For those of you that wonder why it is that people like me get so anxious and agitated when I talk about this subject, I think that the Clean Power Plan is crazy from the perspective of Wyoming. That's just what I think. And it's a free country, and I can think that. I have to give a disclaimer. I'm not speaking for the governor. I'm not speaking for Todd. I'm just speaking for me at this point. I just don't think this makes any common sense. And I'm not sure how it is we get people's attention to come back and add some common sense back. I think I would say that among the more sensible commissioners that I deal with, people feel that carbon regulation is coming, and the question is, how long is the transition period? And the reason I think this is crazy is because I think the transition period that's being proposed is too short for some of the reasons I've shared with you so far. So, if you talk to me again next week, I will have read some more. I've gotten through the 2,315 pages of the final rule and the federal proposal. There are many more miles to go in the technical support documents, and many of them are not yet available. For example, the technical support document that's the stranded assets analysis is not available yet. And will not be, I sent off an email to EPA asking for them to point out where this was, and I got back a polite email saying that any technical support document that's not already available will be made available when the final rule is published. So that's like my father saying, we'll see, and then no. So there's lots more to do about this, and I hope by explaining it this way, you can also appreciate that Todd and I have been asking our legislators to hold off on doing anything this session. I know there are people that feel strongly about this and want to do something about this very, very soon, want to be on record as being strong about this, but for the time being, I think the answer is we got to sort this thing out to figure out some sensible way forward. And the one thing we don't want to do is to have the EPA, for example, deciding who gets what allowances where. I don't necessarily think we want the EPA ruling on how an ERC market would work or giving them the authority or the responsibility for running an ERC market. And I think there are too many things that we need to do here that we need to kind of be calm for a little while, despite the fact that I'm not calm about this subject. Need to be calm for a little while and wait until the path is clear forward. So with that, I hope you do have some questions at this point. It usually gets more lively when there are questions than when I'm chatting.
Well, thank you, Chairman Benier and Director Parfit. So basically what we've got here is something that is clear as mud, which all developers love in making multi-million, if not billion-dollar investments. So thank you both for taking the time With that, we do have quite a bit of time here to take some questions, really important subjects. So with that, I see Ken.
Commissioner, thank you for your good work. You ran through some economics. Do you have a sense of what that is to the average resident's monthly bill?
We thought about trying to figure that out, but the problem is that for each of our companies, they do business in more than one state. So you got to do these allocations. So, for example, I can tell you what the situation is with, let's take PacifiCorp, this is the easiest one. We have an arrangement in place for allocating costs among the 6 states that have customers that share a common generation. But not all their coal-fired generation is in Wyoming. So in order to basically do that calculation, I need to know what's going on with the other, I need to basically be able to do a similar calculation in the other states to sort of figure out how everything's sorted out. And I felt that, honestly, I felt my calculation was back of the envelope enough that I didn't want to go the next step. I did tell one of the legislative committees that I thought a minimum of probably on the order of 10 to 20% for PacifiCorp customers in 2030, just kind of, again, going like this, but I said, don't hold me to it. She said she would. I said, well, please don't. That's where we left it.
Hey, how's it Don? And thank you guys for taking something pretty complex and making it simpler, but still not simple. And still a lot of uncertainty there, which still keeps the complexity high. What I was wondering is, in all this, there's always, the discussion where natural gas is a transition fuel, so these targets under this current plan, I view as just interim targets to a, maybe it's the 7-inning stretch or it's the halfway point in a football game, but the end game is near zero or zero CO2 emissions in general for the energy sector and transportation sector. The president's communicated, puts thing in his climate action plan, and that's the long-term goal. So even with all addressing these in this particular plan, in this bigger context, if that in fact is going to maybe get to that bigger overview plan, given politics and elections and all that, what's your thoughts on all this activity, given that we might even have stricter regs down the road?
I'm just a simple utility commissioner. I won't venture into where we'll be in 10 years on that kind of policy. I mean, you got obviously airplanes, you got natural gas development. I honestly don't know. I have enough trouble keeping up with this.
It just increases the thickness of the mud.
Maybe not letting y'all off that easy, but obviously you have to take a look at it from the state's perspective first, make sure that's kind of our baseline of how we're going to deal with it. But if you think about some kind of carbon trading model and interacting with other states around, and the absence, except for EOR, of a very clear, true commodity market for carbon dioxide and carbon. If you had to think about what a future type of market might evolve if the pressures are such that, because you have such a dichotomy, right, in the West, where you have high renewable factors versus, high, carbon consequences. Is there a tipping point where you really do want to, it's more cost effective to partner in a regional solution than trying to go it alone? Can you just provide some?
Well, there is a kind of a simple solution to that. The federal, or the simple response to that, we have all the latitude in the world to get together with other states, but actually what the EPA has proposed in its model rule is essentially a trading ready program. So if you have a regime in place that can keep track of the ERCs, for example, that has certain other qualities. It's a lengthy list of qualities. They have to be verifiable, enforceable, so on and so forth. And they expect you, they say things like you have to be prepared to keep records of any ERC created and used, or any allowance created and used indefinitely. You know, it's not like you get to throw them away after 3 years. They want them to be public as well. They got this list of things that if you do it, they will approve that and basically treat you as being able to trade RECs or ERCs, or allowances rather, ERCs or allowances across state lines with other states that have received similar EPA approval. They refer to this as being trading ready. I mean, one of the things about the federal rule is they talk about all the flexibility you have, but as you read through what the options are you have, fundamentally, if you're not going to follow the model rule, you got a lot of work cut out for you to justify why not. I have fun of saying it's sort of like if you have a 2-year-old, you say, you don't say, do you want to take a bath? You say, do you want to take your bath before or after dinner? You know, you basically, but you're being pushed to taking a bath one way or another in the sense of you really don't have that many choices in my view. And once I think one of the other things to remember is that when people talked about flexibility before, it was really kind of a suggestion that there might be some give in the overall targets. There might be some way to make it work. So the way, for example, the utilities were thinking about making it work, generally speaking, was if we operate in several states and we can shuttle around the credits that we have from generating wind in particular, then we can ratchet down our facilities somewhat, use the credits we already have, and survive this. Well, once they cut out production from sources prior to 2013, that pretty much went by the boards. So Mark's in a better position than I am to talk about this, but my perception is that the companies are all scratching their heads, and they've got the further problem that it's not clear which states are going to go mass and which states are going to go rate. And I think once you begin to have the conversations that the states are ultimately going to have, I think the issue that's going to wind up being the subject of public hearings is rate or mass. Because you're going to have interest groups that care about one of those. If you're a person who's collecting energy efficiency and wants to market it, you don't want a rate-based arrangement. So I think it's going to get a little crazy and will become, in some respects, kind of almost counterintuitive about who's going in what direction. Stay tuned. Well, that's kind of the problem, is you have to figure out where in all of this is there any place to actually put your feet down so you can understand what it is you're looking at. And I think the talisman is, the places I'd go are, I think we're all being pushed towards mass because it's going to be easier to administer. It's not necessarily where we want to be, but I think we're going to be pushed towards mass, for example. And I think that means we need to begin thinking a little bit more about those allowances and how they're going to be doled out. That's just sort of an example. But overall, if you're to talk about prices, it just becomes very difficult. We did go to a presentation, Todd and I were at a presentation in September, where someone from Pacific Gas and Electric had done some calculations that indicated that the price of an allowance, as opposed to an ERC, in Wyoming would be in the ballpark of $23 in 2025. No, $13 in 2025, $23 in 2030. Meanwhile, in California, an allowance would be $40, but in California, they don't have the same need for allowances that we do. So, and we didn't get those slides. It was one of the few presentations we get, so I'm not sure how confident they were about the results they were getting.
We were discussing last night about the famous Mike Tyson quote, "Everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the face."
Yeah.
It seems a little bit like we were maybe hitting a punch in the face at this point. Can you talk a little bit about what the next steps are? What are the thoughts the different groups are thinking? Because this is such a radical shift from what we saw just a year ago when this rule came out. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'll say something, and I think Todd ought to address that, since he's actually, one of the great things about this is he's responsible for this, and I get to talk about it. My sense is that the state's role in this, at least in one area, has to be with the targets. So we have to do whatever we can do to defend ourselves. The governor's already committed to litigation, but I think we're also working up what I would refer to as a credible petition for reconsideration, which would set up litigation if it were completely denied, based on the kind of things we're talking about why this doesn't make sense. And I think hopefully broadly, and we can phrase it broadly enough so we're not just talking about why it is we're upset about this. I think Janet McCabe at some point said during this meeting that the people that are disappointed about the results of this final rule have a right to be grumpy, and I don't want to be dismissed as grumpy. I think that we have some real questions about the legitimacy of what they've proposed and whether it's reasonable or not. So that's our first project. Then our next project is, once we get that project done, there's a lot to think through about in this rule and where we would go. And anyway, I guess that's what I'd leave off with.
Well, I would reiterate a lot of what Al said. There obviously is going to be litigation across the board. I think what's important to also realize is that when you look at the 47 states that this applies to, you've got states that are okay with where the final rule came out, and I think you've got states that have a real problem. You look at the RGGI states, you look at California, Washington, Oregon, I think they're very supportive of where it came out as a final rule. You look at some of the energy producing states, on the other hand, and obviously there's great concern. And so there will be litigation, and as we've already seen with some of the litigation, you'll have some states lining up on one side and other states joining the litigation on the side of EPA. So I think litigation is inevitable. I certainly wouldn't be one that would say let's put all our eggs in that basket, which is why we're talking about let's get through the rule, let's understand it, let's look at the motion for reconsideration. I think one of the biggest questions that's out there is this a logical outgrowth of the comments that they received on the proposal, on the proposed rule? And I would argue that it's not. So you'll see a lot of discussion along those lines. As far as the next steps, we've besides getting through the reading all of the documents and understanding it, it's the communication with the stakeholders. It's particularly with the utilities. We've started some early dialogue, but we're going to have to continue that discussion moving forward. So, litigation, but on a separate parallel track. I think you have to look at what can we reasonably do to move that ball forward, because it's not going to go away.
Kind of picking up on Al's comment about sort of this principle of, in what you talked about, it evolved into a regional kind of a plan, a final plan, and then moving towards maybe a national, in terms of national electric pricing. But then, this is addressing that, the very angry elephant that Jenny talked about earlier, CO2, but it's still disconnected from all CO2. So the transportation sector, for instance, is not incorporated. So in these larger states with larger population, where a large percent of their CO2 emissions is in their transportation sector, and not necessarily the case in Wyoming, there seems to be a penalty or an extra burden on Wyoming. So could you cross sectors? Is there anything in this plan or opportunity when you're talking ERCs and these other things? Can you cross sectors, or does this have to be solely within the power sector? It seems from a principal argument perspective, if that's a national goal now, then why can't you intermix sectors?
And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you a perfect answer on this, but this gets back to the argument. On the one hand, we're arguing that under the Clean Air Act, you have certain restrictions as to how you can regulate certain entities. states don't have the authority to regulate mobile sources. That authority rests with EPA. But you raise an interesting question in terms of how you solve this puzzle. We're already outside of the fence line when we look at renewables. This would be many steps further away from the fence line, I would think. But the point is well taken. When you look at the CO2 emission mix, I mean, transportation is number 2, right? California, if you look at California versus Wyoming, just as an example, the emissions from transportation in California, according to the Energy Information Administration, would be 6 times higher than what we emit from our electric generating units. And, so there's a bit of an imbalance, but I guess I would also say that I think that's balanced out somewhat by the fact that when you look at the president's overall climate strategy, he has incorporated transportation into that to try to get those reductions.
Add one thing. If you look at the final rule, they become much more specific about saying what qualifies as a renewable source. So there's a list. And some of them are kind of more privileged than others. For example, excuse me, with wind, it is possible to have wind generated in a mass-based state, so you'd otherwise be ignoring it, credited in a rate-based state, provided that there is a power purchase agreement between the generating unit and the rate-based state that shows that that wind is dedicated to that electric generating unit, okay? So as you dig into the details, there's a lot of side bits like that, but I think broadly speaking, the answer is no. They're expecting this to be, actually, I think the other thing is that one of the other things is that ERCs must depend on energy that has been made available to the grid. So I think that you don't get an ERC, if I understand what they're saying correctly, and I probably ought to go read this again. One of the problems of being 66 is you don't remember what's in 2,300 pages. But I think you don't get an ERC for having a solar panel on your roof. It's supposed to be grid oriented.
Okay, do we have any questions from the audience?
Question for Al. Getting to 1305 to keep those coal-fired units in operation in our state, the 5,136 megawatts of wind capacity that we would need to generate. Can you talk about that? Would that, for example, include the 3,000 already planned with Chokecherry and Sierra Madre, or is it over and above that? And other projects that are planned, the one just north of the border in Colorado, for example?
The way that I'm understanding what the rule says is that they're looking for closer bilateral relations between the electric generating unit and the ERCs. Okay, so before it was ambiguous about whether or not if somehow the state could declare that all of the credit for the wind in Chokecherry, for example, should go into a collective bottom line. I don't think that the way this reads, that that's really something they're going to look forward to. And when asked about this by someone else, I've also pointed out that EPA very clearly distinguishes between a REC, which is a state-created right, and an ERC, which is a federally created right. So when somebody asks me, well, does that mean the state can actually pass a statute saying we own that? I'm saying not that clear, because if you're a state and you purport to control a federally created right, you tend to wind up with constitutional problems of one sort or another. And I would hate to commit us to a path that basically said, we're going to make this declaration with the thought that that'll solve this. I think that the clear intention of the rule, and I would say particularly if there were a federal plan, we got FIP'd, pretty clear to me that there would be an insistence, an interpretation and insistence that they be associated with specific electric generating units.
Any other questions from the audience? Wendy?
Thank you. Al, I've asked you this before, but after I listened to the explanation, and you obviously have spent a lot of time reading all the pages, and so I think you probably know this final rule better than most. It seems to me we'll have to pass quite a few new laws in order for a state plan to have statutory authority in certain areas that neither you or DEQ have right now. And a related question is, it also seems to me that the Clean Power Plan is asking utilities to work together in ways that I thought they weren't allowed to under violation of certain federal law.
Let's take the last one first. I'm not sure that, I don't know what the answer to the working together on a multi-state basis would be. I mean, normally when we've been talking to utilities, we've been doing it one at a time, so there's not a apparent antitrust problem. And I would say also we've been talking to utilities first because they're more knowledgeable about this, frankly. And second, it seems to me that if we're the state, we need to be paying attention to what the utilities think might ultimately be feasible. It's not going to do anybody any good if we make pronouncements about what we're going to use, and it's not workable for them. On the question of statutory authority, I think that almost has to wait until we figure out what approach we're going to use. And I don't see how you conceivably do that until kind of the timeline that they were speaking of, which gets you into 2017. I say that because at the very least, you would want to know what the federal government's policy was about doing federal implementation plans, because there are going to be some places we know there are going to be federal implementation plans. One of them is the only people that got hit worse than the northern plains states were the Ute and the Navajo. They had higher increases in what their restrictions would be on their existing plants. And in the federal proposed rule, it says they also propose in the rule to put a federal implementation plan on those tribal facilities, because they're not seeing any inclination on the part of the tribes themselves to assume that responsibility. If I were a Navajo or a Ute, I think I would find that upsetting, but I'm not, so I won't try to purport to speak for them. But I think there's a lot that needs to be done to figure out what it is we'd be asking for. Because I think there's a sharp difference, as I said, between a rate-based sort of package and a mass-based package, particularly because, and with respect to the allowances. So we need to figure out where we're going before we can even ask, and I also agree that some of the things that are being talked about here don't resonate with the way our statute reads in particular. I mean, we're sort of a least cost, least risk based approach to the proposals that utilities submit to us when they talk about wanting to build new generation in particular. I hope that answered your question. I'm trying to answer it as directly as I can, but it's a little difficult. And I don't want to speak for Todd about what statutes he might need. I don't want to, get into that. I can talk about me though. Do you want to take a pass at it?
As far as statutory or rules, again, the right time for that is 2017. As Al mentioned, we really have to sit down and have conversations not only with utilities, but with the communities, and understand which direction we think we might want to go to give at least the base for that discussion with the legislature to to really understand what and if we need to have any statutory changes and what they would look like, but I think it's a little premature to do that until we have a better sense of which direction we would go, rate versus mass, and so forth. So until that time, I think 2017 is the right time for legislation. That means in 2016, though, we have to be having those discussions with the legislature so that they can then be drafting some proposed legislation if there is any needed. Rules will have to come after that. So, but with the eye on that, we have to have a final plan by September of 2018, or it won't matter because we'll get a federal plan put in place.
Tim?
I have a concern that you just mentioned, Todd, and that is talking to the communities. I'm not sure how you go about informing people of the 2,000 pages that you've read, Al, and having them fully understand what it means to their pocketbook. And have you guys given any thought to that at all?
I've given some thought to it. That's why you get the back of the envelope calculation. I mean, I think what I would say, at the very least, you can say anybody that tells you you're going to be saving money, you might be saving money in California somewhere, but at the end of the day, you're not saving money here. I think probably the more important question is there a sense among the public of whether there's a difference between rate and mass and where we should go on that? Because the result's going to be a pocketbook increase. We're going to work on this some more because that's the same question that was asked by one of the legislators. And I really tried to give it a straight answer, but as I told you, very difficult to do that when where the number came from makes no sense, particularly if you're from the West. Makes no sense at all. So you start out with something that makes no sense, and you're supposed to make sense of it. The closest I can come right now is what I did. Maybe if we think about it some more, there might be some other surrogate we can come up with to explain it. But I can tell you $11 billion for the utilities in our state would be a lot of money. And I mean, one other digression, if you'll, that might help you understand what EPA is doing and how they're looking at this. One of the issues that we raised had to do with selective catalytic reduction. We've got 2 plants that are, for regional haze purposes, facing $400 million or so investments. Laramie River Station right away, Pacific Corp for units 1 and 2 at Jim Bridger in 2021, that time frame, but both before the 2022 implementation date. Now, there may be some way to work around this, but it seems to me they've got some fairly big decisions to be making, and we raised a comment about that. The answer from the EPA was that, well, really the problems of a couple of plants don't make any difference. That the acquisition of further pollution control for specific programs like Madsen, we've modeled that out for all the plants, and I think they said for selective catalytic reduction it was like 0.6%, something like that, which is not enough for us to worry about. We're interested in putting together a single national number. We're not interested in dealing with the unique circumstances of unique facilities. Well, I'm thinking, what? Why is that reasonable? I understand why they're saying that. Because they've bumped it up to the level where they basically say, whatever we say, they're going to say, well, problems with one little facility just don't really amount to much. One little state, they don't amount to much either. That's what we're getting from these guys.
Yeah, so just to add to that, one of the questions that I posed to EPA was, as we're taking a look at this, if a facility chose to, say, shut down a unit, could you re-examine the control measures that they have required for regional haze? So you're going to make say a $500 million investment on selective catalytic reduction because that's what the calculation shows you need to protect visibility in a federal area. Well, if you shut down a unit, that was contributing to that, could you then recalculate your regional haze to determine that now you only need low NOx burners over fire air rather than the the SCR? Because that may be a significant factor for a utility that's deciding what direction to go. I haven't gotten an answer back on that one, but that's certainly out there, and the EPA is taking a look at that, and hopefully will get back to us soon. As far as the rest, I think as far as addressing the public, we really have to get a clear understanding of what this final rule is, so that when we do reach out and engage with the public, that we can explain this clearly to the public, so that they have a sense of what it is that we're talking about and what kind of input that we're looking for. But we're a little bit ways away from that yet.
If I could maybe chime in. Out in California, they're saying, well, because all energy efficiency and conservation, the rate may go up, but you're still going to save $7 a year on your bill. So this the argument about, well, does the rate go up, but what's the impact on the bill? I think the biggest issue maybe for us is the jobs lost in some of these power plants. But even, Al, using your back of the envelope calculation of 5,136 megawatts of wind power added to bring, the rates down. Not every, I can't imagine every state being able to do that, because then we would have an oversupply of electricity, so some coal power plants will have to be taken offline if we put that much more wind into the system. And that's where I see the big pocketbook, because then those jobs go away.
Well, I guess I understand that, but I also feel pretty strongly that the stranded asset question is still with us. I mean, when you shut down, let's say you wind up operating all these plants at 40% of capacity. Congratulations, you just saved on fuel costs, but your capital costs are still going to be where they were to start out with, and ratepayers are still on the hook for it. I understand that where the job loss thing comes from, and I think it's particularly poignant in the coal industry. At least seems to me that's going to be the logical consequence, I guess. Rob will tell us about that tomorrow, perhaps, if not tomorrow, sometime soon. Yeah, I think it's got to be a concern to all of Wyoming, but in the meantime, I guess at some level, I'm kind of concerned about the health of the utilities.
Okay. Well, with that, we are actually right on schedule. So I would like to thank Chairman Benier and Director Parfit for taking the time and all the questions from everybody. Clearly, this is a big issue to the state, and we will be calling upon you again as we sift through this. So thank you very much.